Let's begin with a word of prayer together. Loving God, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of all our hearts, be pleasing and strengthening to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Being in places of justice for those that are people that are privileged can feel a little bit edgy from time to time. We know it's the right thing to do, but you kind of feel you're in a place that's not normally your normal place to be. Just over a year ago, gathered at the parking lot of a Taco Bell with about 100 people, signs, protesting, asking for equal wages and benefits at places like Taco Bell and McDonald's and Starbucks. Employees talking about working conditions. Employees talking about the lack of wages and increase, and even the minimum wage isn't enough to be above the poverty line. To join with others in the chance to be there in the parking lot and demand for something to be different for those that have not a whole lot in their life. But there's something powerful about standing with others in that moment. To know that you're not a solo voice, that your voice joins with others and becomes a louder voice. As we gathered there with Stand Up KC, we were there to stand with laborers so that their life could be hopefully different. There could be enough pressure from the voice of justice to rub against the system, a system that's been oppressive to many for so many years. We're standing behind a table in Gardner, Kansas, during Pride Month, a gathering of Pride Fest in Gardner. The 3 years they've had it, St. Andrew has had a table there 2 of the last 3 years. We didn't know about it till late the first year they did it, but we're there the last 2 years. Organizations there that are supportive of the LGBTQ community was there. Dancing and festivities and food and celebrating all in this world, and particularly the LGBTQ community. It's interesting to me that over the last 2 years at the Pride Fest in Gardner, we have been the only church present at that event. Not the only church that could be present, but the only church that was present. While I was there, one of the people I shared a booth with was Shannon Mullican. And man, can she not only talk great, but in terms of interact with people at the table, I'm going, I'll just kind of do what she does. I mean, she does a great job of engaging people and talking to people and talking about her faith and her church. And it's just really fascinating to be a part of that experience. And people kind of walking by and saying, a church? What's a church doing here at the Gardner Pride Fest? And it gave us an opportunity to tell our story and our values and what was important to us. Not long after I moved here, there was a march on KC, a march from downtown down to the Crown Center area, and we walked with signs and marches and yells, standing up for racial justice. And the energy and power as police officers had to shut down the street as we made our way down Main Street, down to the center of town from downtown south. And seeing the onlookers and some being excited about what we're doing and others continually kind of waving off their hands and saying, I can't believe these people. But to be a part of something like that is a really powerful thing. And justice, in many ways, can be distinguished from just caring for people in the moment, helping people out when they need help. It's addressing the very systems that create the problems in the first place. And our scripture text that Kathy talked about was about Sabbath. And it's kind of interesting that Sabbath is brought up a lot in the New Testament in terms of not only observing the Sabbath, but how it should be observed. One of the Jewish texts called the Talmud says there are 24 different categories of rules of how you observe Sabbath. I mean, that's a lot of rules. That's just 24 categories. That's not all the observances of what you can and can't do on the Sabbath. And in Jesus' era, Sabbath was kind of almost used as a way of weaponizing and controlling people. Oh, you're not doing that. You can't do that on the Sabbath. And those that were in power had an opportunity to kind of stay over people because they had full knowledge of all these details of how Sabbath did and didn't work. And every time someone did something that might be considered work or something that extended beyond the boundaries of what Sabbath was supposed to be, they would call them out on it. And these two stories of Jesus in the fields and Jesus in the temple is trying to expose how systems can build up power over time. And systems can create so many rules to protect what they have that they don't want to lose. And Jesus, in the face of all this, says, there is hunger here. There is hunger we can see with our eyes. The disciples are hungry. Can they not just grab a little bit of food and eat? Oh, you can't do that. You can't pluck a head of grain on the Sabbath. And there's hunger right there in front of them, and they're not allowed to pluck the heads of grain. And Jesus encounters a guy in the temple. Hand is deformed, and Jesus wants to help take care of him. You can't heal on the Sabbath. You've got this need right in front of you, and you've got some system that says you can't do that because you want to protect the Sabbath. And Jesus was trying to remind those in that place that Sabbath is about wholeness, wholeness of creation, wholeness of humanity. And he's trying to speak to the very system that's pushing back against him and is not being fearful of that speech. There is a pastor up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His name is Tyler Sitt. And he was in Minneapolis during the events and the murder of George Floyd. And within a year's time, all the thoughts of the experience of that time period in Minneapolis encouraged him to write a book called Stay Awake. And he references the passage of Jesus in the garden before his arrest. And he asked the disciples what? To stay awake. And every time that he comes back and checks on the disciples, they're asleep. And he keeps reminding them to stay awake. It is easy for us that are in power and privilege to drift off into sleep, just to think, well, my world's okay, right? I'll be okay for another day. While we see, like Jesus saw the faces of those that were hungry, saw the faces of those that needed healing. Well, I'll just wait till tomorrow. Maybe I'll be more rested. Maybe I'll have better energy. And Tyler Sitt says in his book, we must stay awake to love. We must stay awake to the empires that are around us. We must stay awake to what's happening in our community. We must stay awake to ourselves and be mindful of ourselves. We must stay awake to the movement of justice and not let it pass us by. We must stay awake so we pay attention to the world in which we live, because we don't live siloed amongst one another. We are intricately woven with one another in our communities. And we must stay awake and with eyes see what we need to see and speak with voices to change the world in which we live. One person, one family, one community, one county at a time. And it happens with movements. And we think, well, how do I get a part of this justice movement? How do I stay awake to all these things? And there is an author by the name of Sean Ginwright that talks in his book called The Four Pivots. He talks about four movements that we go through. One is from window to mirror, which I think is kind of a cool pivot. Window to mirror. We often are kind of wanting to look out. But he said the first thing you got to do, you got to look at yourself. You got to examine yourself and examine the things in you that need repair and tweaking and changing. We open up our minds to educating ourselves and what it means to live in the world with a better sense of education of all the things that are happening good and wrong with the world around us. So first, before we look out, we have to look at ourselves. The second pivot, he says, is moving from transactional to transformational. We can't look as people as transactional things. I did this, check it off the list. I accomplished this, check it off the list. I went to this rally, check it off the list. I went to this Pride Fest, check it off the list. Our goal is not to have transactional things, but look what I did. The goal is to have transformational opportunities of relationship with one another so our society can be strengthened by the relationships we form with one another. The third pivot he talks about is from problem to possibility. Now, most human beings, our tendency is to say, what's wrong with the world? Well, this is wrong with the world, and this is wrong with the world. I wish everyone could just fix this stuff. And we tend to be kind of complainers of things we see that are wrong with the world. And he says we should shift from complaining to being a part of the possibilities of that which can be different in the world. Be a part of the shared solutions with others, knowing that we ourselves don't have the solutions. We ourselves are not the fixers. But together, collaboratively, we come up with a common voice of how we move through solutions and possibilities together with one another. And the last pivot, which I think is really important when he calls it from hustle to flow. Hustle means we are busy people. People come up, how was your day? Well, I had all these meetings. I had to do all these things. And we kind of have this, we've created this pace for ourselves that's an untenable pace, let alone our own lives. We add justice into the mix. How are we supposed to have some pace of life? We can fit all this stuff in. He talks about moving from hustle, from this frantic pace we live, to that of flow, which is what I would call self-care. You got spaces for yourself to be renewed and strengthened. So you can places, you can flow yourself out to others, that there are possibilities for others. I began trying to think through, our racial justice team has created kind of a three-pronged approach to some of the justice work we do. It's education, relationship building, and advocacy. And so I decided to kind of reframe that a little bit. And I said, if we're going to be a part of justice, we're going to have to up our game. And I'm used to kind of focusing on the word up. It's the first thing we have to do is we have to educate up. We have to move into a place where we know more information about more things. If you look at just our adult ed alone over the last 3 years, the topics of things around justice have been amazing. We've had people in from community organizing organizations like More Squared and the Good Faith Network. We have Kifa coming a week from now. We've had organizations that do all kinds of social justice work. We've had the Urban League of Kansas City. We've given money to the Urban League of Kansas City. We've given money to the NAACP of Johnson County. We've kind of found ways to educate ourselves of who are people we need to educate ourselves about, as well as educating ourselves about injustices and ways that we have done damage in relationships with one another. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, we had a topic on white Christian nationalism with Jess Williams and talking about that. In 2021, we had 60 members of this church participate in an anti-racism training. And that's a lot of people in one congregation to do that. A year later, Judy and Avis led us in level 2 anti-racism training, faith into action or justice into action. We had 40 people participate in that. We've got this 3-series piece going on white Christian nationalism. We have 45 people participating in it. We've got to educate up. We've got to move ourselves up to know more about more things of what's going on in the community, what's going on in the world, what scholars and writers are writing about this that can inform our thinking. So it's not just, well, I think. We need more than just what I think. We need the research and the minds and the hearts of people from various diverse backgrounds informing how we think about the world in terms of justice. So we have got to educate up. The second thing we got to do is we got to connect up. Because it's not just about being educated. We got to be connected to other people from other backgrounds and other experiences and other life stories and other backgrounds that were not like our own. So we've connected up. We realize that justice work, all of a sudden we think, we need to do justice work. Well, it's been going on for a long time. There are already organizations and people been doing this work for a long time. We've just got to connect with them and join the work that's already there. And so instead of me going by myself, going to Taco Bell and saying, I'm going to hold up a sign, we need better wages here, Stand Up KC is already doing that. So I'm going to go where Stand Up KC is. I'm going to join the other voices, and all of a sudden a group of 5 becomes a group of 100, and maybe 100 becomes a group of 1,000. And when we have a larger and larger voice, the system that is unjust starts to pay attention to a louder voice that's more unified with one another. We have to connect up. We've just in recent months begun to develop a strong relationship with Second Baptist Church of Olathe, doing mobile food pantry work, Medicaid expansion work, trying to educate around that. All this kind of work is about connecting up. And the last word I would say is we've got to show up. We've got to be in places where we need to be. Not when it's convenient for us to be there, but when other people are there, we have to show up as well. I'm not sure I can fit that into my busy schedule. Well, we're too much on the hustle side and not on the flow side of how we think about where we are and how we make a difference. The more we wait in showing up, the more we let status quo just carry on in our society, only we wish things would have been better. We have an opportunity almost every week to show up somewhere within the community to make a difference. What it means to be a progressive church, sometimes we cross over. Many times there's this idea that religion and politics, or the political or the public sphere, are to be separate from one another. But if we look at this passage in Luke 6, Jesus was right there in the middle of religious life and public life and civic life. When Jesus was speaking about Sabbath, he was speaking about the world in which he lived, wasn't being satisfied with what he saw that systems were unjust and needed to speak against them. Sometimes the church is called to be out in the political arena, not necessarily to take sides and to be partisan, but to speak to social issues of the day, to speak to those that are vulnerable and marginalized, because Jesus' ministry is all about that. It's not just about caring for people in the moment, which Jesus did as well. But if we chart through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, sometimes in indirect ways, sometimes in direct ways, sometimes in overt ways, speaking out against the very systems that prohibit people from being their full selves. A progressive church is willing to step out on the edge of justice, the edge of making a difference in the community. Not just providing enough food and enough shelter, but challenging things of affordable housing in Johnson County. Making sure there's no food deserts in the KC metro area. Making sure there's accountability to our policing systems where there's profiling of people of color. And the list goes on. We can just assume that everything is normal. But when we educate up and we connect up, and we show up,